Okay, so everybody, welcome to our second Culture Change Roundtable. Is social division all in our heads? We are so happy to have you all join us around this table for what is sure to be a very rich discussion regarding the experience of and the mindsets related to social division. My name is Kalia Diani Pitts. I'm the Director of Engagement Initiatives from Frameworks Institute. Frameworks is a social science research organization that assists nonprofits with communication for social change. So first, we're going to get some housekeeping out of the way. As you see in the chat, you are more than welcome to use the chat box to share your ideas, your feedback, even to network, ask questions. Start off by introducing yourself, shout out your organization, your affiliation, your state, your lands, and something you're noticing about culture and how it's been changing over the past 2 or 3 years, actually. For anybody who is interested, I will put our music and our musician who provided that music in our chat box. Feel free to follow Frameworks on Twitter as well, where we'll be live tweeting some things about this event. I'll put that in the chat as well. And now we're going to get on to the good stuff. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Drew Vollmer, who is the Senior Director of Research. I hope I got your title right, Drew. Just realized I didn't double check that. Drew, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Kalia. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about the Culture Change Project as a whole, provide just a little bit of background on the project, and then introduce a finding that has come out of the project, out of the research that we've been doing, that'll set up the conversation that Dorian, Erica, and Marissa are going to have. Really looking forward to hearing from you all. So this is going to be quick. The Culture Change Project is a project that we started when the pandemic hit, economic disruptions attached to it. We know from history that periods of social and political upheaval can also be times of cultural flux, can be times in which culture changes more rapidly than typical periods. And we wanted to understand whether and how culture was in fact changing in response to the upheavals that we've been going through, initially the pandemic, the economic disruptions attached to it, and then the racial justice uprisings of 2020, January 6th. We're going through this period of incredible social upheaval, and we wanted to understand how is culture changing. So we've put together a whole big program of research, mix of qualitative and quantitative research, quarterly focus groups, some one-on-one interviews, a tracking survey. We've been doing all of this to understand how these cultural mindsets, these deep assumptions and implicit understandings that people use to think about big social issues, how these are changing shape, changing in salience in response to the events that we're going through. I'm not going to get into the finer details here. It is worth noting that we've got a whole bunch of findings that have come out of this project. You can find some of those in a report that we put out over the summer. We're going to be focusing on one in particular today. And this is a finding that has emerged particularly through the focus group research that we've been doing. We found that there is an assumption, a widespread assumption among our research participants, that division is a product of our collective imagination. Now, it's worth noting that in these focus group conversations, there is a whole lot of talk about unity and social division. This is a widespread preoccupation of people across demographic groups, across ideological groups. People are really concerned about the divisions that we are going through and think that social division is perhaps more severe now than it has been in recent memory. There are a range of different ways that people make sense of these divisions, and it's important to note that, more progressive ways, more regressive ways. One of the mindsets that people are using is this idea that our social divisions are essentially all in our heads. They're a matter of collective psychology. When people are thinking with this mindset, they tend to point the finger at talk, the idea that the way that we talk to one another is through news media, through social media, in any sort of conversations. The cause of our social division is that people are talking to one another in ways that are divisive. We have a lot of talk that is riling people up, cultivating grievance, and it's that is undermining social cohesion, social consensus. When people are thinking in this way, when they're relying upon this assumption, they tend to conclude that if we just got rid of talk, of this kind of divisive talk, then we would be more unified. Now, it's important to note that this mindset is more heavily relied upon among the conservative participants in our research. There's a way in which we can actually trace it back to very familiar talk about colorblindness around race. We see this mindset as kind of a changed version, expanded version of this very familiar idea that if we just didn't talk so much about race, then our racial divisions would go away. A familiar idea, a highly problematic one. This mindset is kind of an expanded version of that. It's being this idea that it's talk about our divisions that creates division itself is being expanded to talk about not just race, but transgender identity, LGBTQ identities more generally, as well as a range of broader social issues. What I want to highlight is that this mindset can be activated through some of the framing that we see both on the right, but also interestingly on the left or among more liberal sources. So we see really strategic attempts to engage this way of thinking on the right in the way that all of the exclusionary and reactionary legislation, anti-CRT legislation, anti-transgender legislation, the Don't Say Gay bills, these pieces of legislation are being framed in terms of divisive concepts. So this framing is an intentional strategy to get people to see claims for justice as themselves attempts to divide us, as attempts to exclude people who might be made uncomfortable by that talk. So again, this is intentional and strategic framing to take these really hateful pieces of legislation, these exclusionary pieces of legislation, and frame them as an attempt to restore unity, attempt to ensure that we aren't divided. So again, we see that the way in which this mindset is being activated intentionally through framing that is attempting to legitimate this kind of legislation. The interesting thing is that we can see ways in which framing on the left can actually potentially, sometimes potentially unintentionally, cue this mindset as well. So we're all familiar with critiques on the left of right-wing social media, critiques that are very much justified in all sorts of ways. But sometimes these critiques can suggest that if we just didn't have, or can lead people to infer that if we just didn't have these toxic media personalities, people like Tucker Carlson, or back in the day with Jon Stewart, Bill O'Reilly, who were riling up grievance, who were talking in ways that were fueling grievance, we didn't have that kind of talk, then perhaps the kind of social divisions that arise from that kind of talk might go away. There is a very legitimate critique of right-wing media ecosystems that comes from this, but it's also important to recognize the way in which this kind of framing may itself, perhaps inadvertently, cue the idea that the problem is the talk rather than the underlying material or structural factors that actually create injustice and lead to social division. So this idea that our divisions are all in our heads has some challenges. It potentially obscures structural and material bases of division, the fact that there are actual material interests that are at stake in our divisions. There are injustices that we need to deal with, and this is just not just a matter of how we talk. Right now, because there is such a preoccupation with unity, we have to recognize that this mindset can potentially be really easily activated, as we saw in some of that divisive concept legislation framing, is trying to take advantage of this. And I think there's a danger that this mindset can lead to a disproportionate focus on news and social media. So this is a complex finding. It's a tricky finding. Really looking forward, Dorian, Erica, to hearing your thoughts about what the implications of this are. With that, I will hand things back over to you, Kalia.
Thank you so much, Drew, for laying the groundwork for us. And thank you, everybody, for participating in the chat. Welcome, welcome. We have people from Utah to Virginia, from Lenape lands to Ojibwe lands. And I love the conversations, perceptions of apartheid, polarization, social media. Keep it coming. We want to keep the conversation going in the chat. We definitely do read this. Now, the people you really came to see. It is my pleasure to introduce our roundtable guests, Erica Williams-Simon and Dorian Warren. Erica Williams-Simon is an award-winning narrative strategist, author, creative, and interviewer. As the founder and former head of Snapchat's Creators Lab, Erica creates content and conversations that help a diverse digital native generation tell new stories about who we are and how we want to live. Simon received the O Magazine Women Rule Leadership Award and has been featured in Harvard Business Review, The Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Essence Magazine. She is a self-proclaimed armchair theologian and preacher's daughter for life, serves on the board of colorofchange.org and NPR's Generation Listen. For her social impact work, Simon has been named one of Politico's top 50 politicos to watch, NAACP's 40 Under 40, and World Economic Forum Global Shaper, and an Aspen Institute Ideas Fellow. Welcome, Erica. And welcome to Dorian. Dorian T. Warren is a progressive scholar, organizer, and media personality who has worked to advance racial, economic, and social justice for over 2 decades. As a commentator on public affairs, Warren has appeared regularly on TV and radio, including NBC Nightly News, ABC, MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, BET, BBC, NPR, Bloomsburg, and NY1. Goodness gracious. Among other outlets, he has also written for The Nation, Huffington Post, Newsweek, Salon, Washington Post, New York Times, Medium, Ebony.com, and Boston Review. In 2013, he was included in the list of NBC's The Griots 100 People Making History Today. Currently, Dorian is serving as president for Community Change, co-chair for the Economic Security Project, and co-host of the podcast System Check. Thank you, Erica and Dorian, for just being awesome and being here. Now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, to moderate this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalia. I love how you said my name. So Dorian and Erica, welcome again. I'm very excited to moderate this discussion, but I also want you to consider these questions sort of jumping off points for a conversation, and feel free to speak to one another, and take it in the interesting places where I know you'll want to take it. So, but let me just start with my first question. So Dorian, with your work on at Community Change, and Erica, your work as a narrative strategist, you both work with influencers and mission-driven organizations to make change using narrative and story. And I'm wondering how you see this mindset that we're discussing today playing out in your own work.
Erica, you want to go first? You have the youngest child.
I do. We were talking before this one. I have a 6-month-old. Dorian has a 2-year-old. So anyway, thank you all so much for having us. Was it just me, Dorian? Is it so uncomfortable hearing your bio read like that and having to sit and listen to it? We were both kind of cringing on the inside, but thank you all so much for having us. Well, so first, let's not bury the lead. The question, I think, posed in the title of today's event is social division all in our heads. I would say, and the communities that I work with would say, absolutely not. No, it is not, right? And so when I was first presented with this research, I had a visceral reaction, which I think is actually the sign of really good information and good data, is when it challenges what is your perception of something, your lived experience, conventional wisdom. And so my first reaction was, absolutely not, it's not all in our heads. And who thinks it is all in our heads? And why would someone want to think that it's all in our heads? But that actually is the critical question here, right? To begin, why would someone think that, or why would someone want to think that? And I think there are bad faith reasons and good faith reasons, right? So the bad faith reasons why you might want to believe that social division is a product of our collective imagination or is made up and is exacerbated by all this talk. I think we saw some examples of that in Drew's presentation, right? When there is an intended outcome, there's a nefarious intent in spreading that message in order to silence certain communities, in order to move forward a policy that you want to advance. And when there are these kind of puppeteers behind the scenes, strategizing and using that logic as a way to advance a particular goal. I think we all are familiar with that. Then there's a good faith reason, which is actually where I spent a little bit of my time thinking about, because I find that's where it shows up most often in my work and in the communities that I work with, right? And so a good faith reason would be, as humans, human nature is that division makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes it's because we want to avoid accountability, which I would still kind of put in the bad faith side, but other times it's because we actually believe that division prevents us from achieving a collective goal. It's because division makes us feel lonely, or certainly more alone, and we want to feel unity. We want to feel a part of something and a part of a community. I think about all the division that has arisen around people's dinner tables, right? In small interpersonal settings, it makes us more comfortable to find a cause for that division that is something other than us actually being divided on issues that matter. And so when I think about where that shows up in my life, in my work, more importantly, in my work on a daily basis, I actually see this playing out in intra-community divides and intra-community conflicts quite often, right? So I think about the messaging around gender. If you identify as a woman, there's all this messaging around, but we're all women. Women stick together. Women have to stick together. We are, being divided by the right, or we're being divided by the powers that be that want to advance anti-women policies. We are all the same. It's women first, women, women, women. And then you look at exit polls and recognize, wait a minute, maybe there is some division there, right? Or I work a lot with faith communities. And in faith communities, there is an overwhelming desire to allow a shared faith tradition. I'm a person of faith. In my bio, it says I'm a preacher's kid for life, right? And in the particularly the Christian communities that I work with, there is a desire to believe that that identity, that shared faith tradition, overrides or trumps all other divisions, and that anything else is an attack. It's an attack on us because we have bigger fish to fry here than these small little divides, these conversations about race. And many times where I see that, it is, again, in good faith. It's because folks feel that unity is a value worth fighting for, that unity is ultimately what is essential and necessary to thrive. And so I think when we in this conversation today, when we talk about how do we address this, we have to acknowledge that it shows up in places where it is not just intended for negative consequences or for negative aims, but that there is a real desire from people to actually be a part of a whole, and to see something that otherwise may, if you actually get underneath and see the values divisions, be very uncomfortable and may not allow for folks to work together, that folks want to believe that it's possible. And so then you look for someone to blame. Think about this in interpersonal relationships, which I love. I love the ability to kind of compare cultural scenarios and cultural contexts with interpersonal relationships, because it's much easier for us to process how do we behave, how do we think. And in interpersonal relationships, right? If you see a division between you and a partner, you and a friend, you have a couple options. You can ignore it altogether. You can address it, which is really, really hard and uncomfortable and painful, and you don't know where it's going to end. Or you can blame something on it, right? You can blame an outside source. And so there's a reason why I think we do this. And thinking that through helped me see where it shows up in my work in a way that I might not have when I first heard this idea of it being all in our heads. So I've talked a lot. Dorian, what do you think?
Oh, wow. That was super insightful, seriously, Erica. And let me just say thanks to the entire Frameworks crew for inviting us to be in this conversation, Erica, and with you, Marissa. So definitely this is not all in our heads. And I'm going to go in a slightly different direction from Erica and go back to history for a minute, because I think that's often instructive when we're talking about divisive talk, so to speak. And I go back to the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow in the South. And just to make the point, it wasn't just divisive talk that resulted in the rise of Jim Crow authoritarianism in the South. The implication is if we somehow just didn't talk about Black freedom, that our politics would have been different. And that's just laughable on the face of it, because we know there was a political mobilization to recreate the racial and gender hierarchies in the South in particular. And a small, particularly white, powerful minority benefited from those hierarchies and quote unquote divisions. And so that gets to one of the points from Drew's slides, right? That just saying that it's divisive talk, that's the problem, erases the underlying material and structural bases of division, that there are actual material interests at stake. I'll go back even further for a second, because I'm a nerd. I was trained as a political scientist, and go back to the Federalist Papers from the framers of the Constitution, who wrote famously that factions are inevitable. Essentially, divisions are inevitable. And in their minds, it was between, of course, all white property owners versus the vast majority. And the argument was you can't eliminate the source of the factions. So you can't eliminate the division. And the project, and we know that it was deeply flawed, right? But it was to construct a political system to channel and manage inevitable divisions. So that's just the fun history point. I'll say in terms of our work at Community Change, we've been doing some what we call narrative ideas labs with low-income folk across race, ordinary people, and our findings are very consistent with this Frameworks research. And I would say in terms of identifying the sources of division, yes, there's partisanship. That's a big factor, of course. There is strategic racism tactics. There's also what we heard from listening to folks, a deep distrust of elites. And by that, I don't mean the media. I mean the sense that the entire system is rigged against people and people like me. And that's how a lot of the folks we talked to articulated some of the sources of division. It wasn't around talk, and it wasn't around media. So I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Marissa.
That was great. I love how you both came at this from different directions. It was really informative, and then sort of a lot to think about. And I think part of that is that this mindset is very complicated, as Drew said, and the implications of it is incredibly complicated. So having this conversation, I think, is really important and helpful. So one of the things that Dorian, actually you touched on, and this came up when Drew was speaking earlier, is the sort of anti-critical race theory, anti-history rhetoric that's been drawing upon this mindset in the past year or two. And the idea that like the division and difference is all in our heads. So in schools across the country, it's being used as a justification to not talk about race and not teach our full history of our nation, because that's just going to stoke divisions and create differences within schools and among students. So I'm wondering, you've already spoken a little bit about this, but where and how else are you seeing this mindset being activated at a national level or in conversations that are similar? And also, if you have stuff that you want to talk about more specifically about this sort of critical race theory and anti-history discussion, that would be great too.
I could start with the first part of the question, and that is in terms of like other places where we're seeing this. I do think we are seeing a value division around the question, frankly, of liberal democracy. And I'm thinking about, there was a great Perry Bacon column in the Washington Post on this a couple of days ago. And I think that to go back to, if we go back to the Reconstruction example a little bit, because we've had these one step forward, two steps back throughout American history. And I think one of the places where we see this show up is in the promise of democracy to disrupt hierarchies. In terms of race, obviously gender, and other places, religion, that disruption of hierarchies often prompts the search for order and security in terms of human identity and a reversion to some mythic, glorious past. So often we see that through race or gender or class, but sometimes, and I think in this moment, right, given what we've just lived through the last couple of years, an insurrection and an attempted coup on the Capitol, I think there's also some anxieties around democracy itself. And it's not just in the United States. I think this is a global phenomenon. And then there's a value division in terms of the instability, I think, created, frankly, by the liberation efforts for marginalized groups. And so I think when you put it in that perspective, then the critical race, the anti-critical race theory, anti-history rhetoric makes more sense. And this is not the first time, by the way, we've experienced this kind of backlash to teaching history in our country. There is a backlash to teaching about, frankly, the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. So this is the latest manifestation of trying to tell a story, an accurate story, a factual story about our true past in this country. But I would say I just want to put democracy on the table as well, because we're in a moment where, for some people, democracy itself is threatening in some ways.
I'm thinking Dorian used the word story in there, and I'm thinking about so the folks that I work with, a lot of them are actually consider themselves to be storytellers, right? So creatives, artists, writers, filmmakers, media makers writ large. And what's so interesting is when you talked about the impact of that rhetoric and the direction where it is usually directed is towards folks who are fighting for liberation, towards folks who are trying to disrupt the status quo. Think about that in these communities where creators and storytellers are trying to tell the stories of their truth and the realities that they are seeing and experiencing. And within, this is so interesting, we're blaming media for creating the divisions. And then when storytellers of color, when folks who are actually trying to elevate these narratives that could be disruptive to the status quo try to tell those stories, the gatekeepers then say, that's too divisive. We don't want to hear that. And so it's a really interesting kind of circular logic there, that by talking about it, you create the division, and yet then we have some on the quote unquote other side who then want to exacerbate division, right? It's this really interesting, I mean, it's not that interesting, it's a strategy, it's a tactic, it's a silencing tactic, and it's an oppressive tactic.
And you're actually, that was a great segue into my next question. I did want to ask super quick, Dorian, can you repeat the author of that Washington Post article? Because I have a feeling that folks would be interested in reading it.
Perry Bacon, and I'll put it in the chat as well.
Okay, great, thank you. But so yeah, Erica, you're leading right into my next question, which was about the media and perceptions of the media. And this idea that this division is being sort of deliberately activated by the media and those who have power to control it. So if we're seeking to create progressive change, this type of thinking in this discourse could be a good thing. So for example, drawing attention to the real and harmful media tactics that we're seeing, like the racialization of the working class. It's a key part of the race class narrative strategy. But of course, there's also dangers. So there's a risk of leading people to focus too much on how we're talking, rather on the very real and systemic sources of inequity and difference, which you both also just talked about. So my question is, how helpful do you think it is to draw attention to the deliberate ways in which social divisions are being activated by the media? And if we are going to draw attention to this, how do you think we should do it in ways that aren't going to backfire or reinforce things that we don't want to reinforce?
Can we go? I can start. I would say, for the most part, I think pointing to social divisions being activated by media is not helpful. Now, there are people in our ecosystem that do really great work focusing on disinformation, misinformation, that kind of, like, I think that's important. But what I'm about to say won't surprise anybody here, because I'm gonna put my organizer hat on. I think the primary way out of this thicket is through organizing, is through connecting people, is through collective action. Good old-fashioned community organizing. So the question for me is, like, how do we create opportunities for connection between real people in places or even digitally that help people build story and tell their stories through non-elite trusted messengers? So it's very bottom-up approach to narrative change and storytelling. And I do think that this then gets to a different diagnosis of the problem. And that is, from where I sit, the lack of social connection in civil society, the lack of belonging. And so my approach would be to reinvigorate organizing and storytelling, connecting people through storytelling and action, which requires, like, the talk and storytelling is necessary, but not sufficient. When people take action together, the transformative effects are much more powerful than simply consuming stories or narratives. How do we get people a sense of agency to tell stories and narratives? And it also goes to, if you want to, if we think talk is divisive, then I think the media isn't the culprit. I would point to, for instance, the places where people make meaning. So for example, particularly on the right, I think a lot about the evangelical church. Those are places where folks every week are in an environment with others where there is a lot of talk happening, meaning is being made, and ideology is being formed, to be blunt. That's not a media thing. That's in an institution that people belong to. And so what is our approach frankly, from where I sit in the progressive ecosystem to also create those places for meaning making for people, and especially with trusted messengers,
Yes, 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 yes. But I'll say a yes and. So from where I sit in the ecosystem, it is all of that is true. That really the meaning making, the sense making of it all. The best way to address that is empowering people and giving people the tools to tell their own stories, to become part of the narrative landscape, right? But I will say that when we're talking about media in this conversation, there is media elite, and then there is social media, which for a lot of the folks that I work with actually is a driving force of ideology and how people are seeing the world around them and seeing themselves. And so in that case, even though I do think the conversation about media can oftentimes be a distraction from the real stuff and from the real issues, I think in that case, I am a fan. I believe at a personal level, anytime you're being played, it's good to let people know you're being played. Like, it's good to kind of name it. But I think we have to be intentional about how we name it, right? I think we have to be intentional with our language and very deliberate with our language, that there is a difference between your fears and your emotions being played on as opposed to being created and manufactured. I think ultimately, especially for those of us who consider ourselves in any way, shape, or form to be narrative strategists or narrative experts or storytellers or even organizers, right? This sense that when we are naming something and when we are helping folks see something, we sometimes forget what the ultimate goal is, right? I believe that we should ultimately be helping people become more, I like to say, story smart. Or how are you communicating narrative literacy so that people, when they are consuming, because they will still, no matter how much we say that the real work is happening offline, which it is, and that the real work is happening not on your screens, people are still by nature consumers, and we will be consuming content everywhere we go, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And so if we help people understand, what are the questions I need to be asking when I'm consuming content, right? Who is telling me this story? What happens if I believe this story, right? Does this story shape my behavior? And if it does it shape it in a way that helps some and harms others? If we can allow folks to exercise that muscle of learning how to be more literate, I think this works for the mis and disinformation argument as well. But I think that has to be a part of it, because as we're seeing that social media is just a part of our landscape. It is, whether we want it to be or not, a part of the privately owned public square, right? And so I think we, at the same time as we're doing all of that meaning making offline and that sense making in communities and having conversations face to face with people, which is ultimately the most important and most impactful, we should also be helping people understand how to process what they're consuming.
Amen.
I love that term, narrative literacy. That's so helpful and something that I need to kind of marinate on for a little bit. And I think what again, y'all are thinking about my questions ahead of time. But I think my next question is about something that you were talking about, I think implicitly here, which is the dangers of gaslighting and misinformation and how we're going to counter them. So, how do you see that sort of it's all in our heads mindset as relating to this discussion around misinformation, and can we use it to counter misinformation, or does it just make that work harder? And sort of what does this work that we're talking about today say about how we can do this moving forward?
Erica, you want to go first on this one? You're infinitely smarter on this question.
No, you can go first.
I mean, I don't have a good, I don't know if I have a good answer, except to say, and I often hear Erica's colleague, Rashad Robinson at Color of Change, talk a lot about the difference between narrative content and narrative infrastructure. And when you talk about narrative infrastructure, and Erica, you were just talking about this in terms of like social media is a reality, right? It is a reality. And yes, on those platforms, is there mis and disinformation? Absolutely. And so what is the way, I think there are probably a couple strategies. I know Color of Change is actually leading a very public campaign to stop disinformation. But as I think about the question, it's not like mis and disinformation is new. It's not like it just happened 10 years ago, right? It's always been a part of human societies. And as storytelling platforms have changed, we have the misinformation, disinformation has always been there, from print to radio to TV to social media. Like there's always been mis and disinformation in any kind of communication platform. And so the question is, what are the strategies to disrupt and to transform those attempts at mis and disinformation? And I'll go back to the point around trusted messengers and institutions, frankly, as places where people can make meaning together with those trusted messengers. And that can also be on social media too, by the way. There's like a lot of great experimentation happening on TikTok right now of folks doing storytelling and linking it to their friends and family, right? Because they are the trusted messengers in their social networks. So there are multiple strategies, but I'm sorry I can't answer the question super well because it's a really, really tough question. So that's why I'm really curious what you have to say, Erica. But I guess my point would be, how do we think about narrative infrastructure, broadly speaking? How do we think about equipping, and Erica's prompts are really helpful. How do you equip trusted messengers to be sort of organizers and storytellers in their own spheres of influence? And just remember, like, this is not a new problem. It's manifestation. The manifestation of it in this moment is new, but it's not a new problem.
Dorian, first of all, it's a complicated question, which is why I let you go first. To be totally honest, I don't have the answer either. But I always love how you approach these questions by going back in history and reminding us that things aren't new, because I actually find that to be a helpful communications tool. I find that to be a helpful relationship building when you're talking about organizing and building community, and reminding people that some of these problems are age old. And so that what you're experiencing is unique. The context might be unique, right? But the issue itself is age old. Now, unfortunately, what that means sometimes is it may not be going away anytime soon either, right? That there will always be iterations of the misinformation, disinformation problem. I think we talked about narrative literacy and helping people figure out how do you actually kind of combat that and at least ask yourself the right questions around it. I think trusted storytellers, like Dorian said, is 100% the right way to go. But I also think that there's a deeper question here, and this is why I love that you mentioned spiritual centers, religious institutions, just these kind of places of meaning making. That's where my mind goes, but there are so many others. Because there's a deeper question at play here about what is truth, right? It gets very existential sometimes, right? Which is why it's such a hard question to answer. It gets very existential because while there's always been misinformation and disinformation, it seems to me as if right now we're in a moment when there is less concern about what is true or not just, I have something that's true and you have something that's true, but that those things can be equal. And I think that's where true journalism actually plays a role here. And so a plug to invest in good journalism and support good investigative journalism and folks who have some integrity around that, because all truths are not equal, right? And all truths are not true. And I don't know where that message is communicated, if not in those private spaces of meaning making, and if not with not just trusted messengers, but folks who are trained, folks who are actually trained on how to communicate messages, because even folks who are trusted, if they don't understand language, if they don't understand nuance, if they don't understand audience, if they don't understand all of these pieces, then there's still danger in that and how the stories are told. So there are multiple solutions here. And again, to Dorian's point, this problem has been here before and will probably continue to be here, but how can we mitigate it and in some ways overcome it in the current moment? I think those are some of the ways.
Thank you. Yeah, this discussion of trusted messengers, I think, is so important to how we figure out how to make sure that narrative change happens, and definitely something we're thinking about here at Framework. So thank you for surfacing that.
I just want to make sure we caught Erica's addendum. It's not just trusted messengers, it's trusted and trained
exactly.
messengers.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up again. Yeah, that's such an important part of it. So actually, I do have a question that's sort of focused on you, Dorian, but Erica, I want you to feel free to run with this as well. So Dorian, we know that in your ideas lab work, you've proposed appealing to unity in messaging as a progressive pathway for care and community action. So how can we engage with this widespread concern with unity in a progressive way and counter the idea that calling out injustice is divisive? So interested in your thoughts on that.
So my team is gonna be a little upset with me because I generally don't like the term unity. And I just want to say we were reporting out what we heard from ordinary people in our labs, right? The focus is on unity, and that's often the go-to, frankly, in these conversations. Personally, I prefer, and I would want to test some hypotheses, I prefer the term solidarity. Because that just gets you in a different place, and it especially primes people to take action together. Right, so like solidarity means you don't have to agree or be unified even, but you can join together with someone in a fight against injustice. And so I think there are multiple pathways into being in solidarity around something. And like with my organizer head on, like that's the approach that I would want to test out, honestly, is like, okay, here's a value, here's a goal of the world we want to see. Here are some obstacles that get in the way. How do we then therefore act together in solidarity with one another to show up to try to change a system or a rule that is affecting our lives? That's the approach that I would frankly want to test out. Like, I'm not saying I have the answers. But it's just it's a slightly different frame than the unity frame, which is like the go-to thing, versus a frame of solidarity. And what does that mean? I would love to have that conversation with, hundreds of people at the grassroots level about what does solidarity mean in this moment.
That's so beautiful, because what it's saying is we're not the same, but we can be in this together. We actually are in this together. And it goes back to something you said in the very beginning about the Federalist Papers and the framers and the intention, perhaps failed experiment though it might be, to create mediating institutions that can help us. And so I think part of the challenge right now is, in absence of those institutions functioning, and in absence of those institutions functioning as we would want them to function, how can we still come together to meet some collective goals, knowing that we are different, knowing that we have some divisions. And I guess the question, I don't want to push us in another direction, but when I say things like this, usually the pushback is, but man, some of these divisions, I mean, they're real, and we should be trying to actually come closer together on these issues. We should actually be trying to get folks to have shared values. I'm so curious, Dorian, in your organizing, what do you say to that when people say, no, I don't want to come together with someone who challenges my humanity or who doesn't, should we still be trying to be in solidarity with those folks? What do you say when you're doing that kind of organizing?
It's tricky. I would say there are multiple on-ramps into taking action, collective action, into organizing. And so for the reasons of, like, I would not ever want to put anyone in a harmful or toxic situation. That doesn't mean we don't need to think about strategies and tactics to organize people from where they start. Right? That's like organizing one-on-one, you start where people are at, but you don't leave them there, right? And so what's the political education? And often it's through, again, I can't emphasize this enough. And I say this as a former teacher, right? So I care a lot about words, I care a lot about language, I care a lot about storytelling, but there is something in organizing people to take action together in a fight with a villain that can be transformative. So let me give you a concrete example here. Early in my career, I was a union organizer. And in the context of union organizing, and especially in a multiracial, multigender workplace, I used to work with the Hotel Workers Union. You have to win a union in a workplace, you have to get to 50+1, right? You need a majority of workers to say, we want the union to be our collective vehicle for representation. Now, if you just say, well, there are divisions on race, on gender, on immigrant status and a lot of things, if you just started there and said, well, there's division and so there's nothing to do about it, then you're never going to win and you're never going to transform the working conditions for workers. So first, you do have to do the talk and storytelling, but there is nothing more powerful than putting a group of workers in action to do, say, take direct action against an employer or the boss that can help to transform people and get them to see that their individual self-interest is actually linked, their fates are linked to the broader collective. And so that's one particular pathway. When you're starting with a group of folks that like might not agree on most things, and you don't ever want to silence folks, and especially it's always the most marginalized that gets silenced, right? So how do you figure out organizing strategies that involve storytelling? Let me give you one other example. I remember writing the curriculum for something called the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride in 2003. And it was an attempt to really agenda set around the issue, the longstanding issue of immigrant justice. And we wrote this curriculum that was an exercise in people telling their migration stories. So for undocumented folks in particular, to be able to tell their stories of like, why were they pushed out? Why did they leave their countries and what attracted them here? But then we also had Black people telling their migration stories. Why did folks leave the Jim Crow South? What were the push factors and what were the pull factors in particular to northern cities? And in that process of storytelling, you're not basically saying, don't talk about your history, don't talk about race, don't talk about, you're actually putting it on the table and saying, actually, this is my experience. Here is what's different and here is what's common about it. And can we then join together in a common fight to transform our lives? So I'm trying to give you some concrete examples of why I believe collective action in particular has to be paired with certain kinds of storytelling right, yeah.
I'm so excited because in my story brain, what I'm hearing though is still, so there's the practice of storytelling, which you talked about in the beginning of each of those stories, each of those accounts, right? There was storytelling, but the collective action is actually still not just activated by, but it exists because of story models and narrative models that are in the world, right? So in that union story, folks know what to do in a fight because we have seen the David and Goliath story over and over again.
And yes, exactly.
So what you're doing is tapping into that narrative, that mental model that people are, oh, I know what to do when you tell me who my enemy is. I've seen this and I know it's possible for me to win because I've seen this story play out over and over again. So any way you slice it, story is at the base of all of it.
And your point is we can be strategic in which kind of stories we are activating for folks versus others.
Yes, yes.
So sorry to break in. I want to listen to this conversation forever. And I actually have like 80 more questions myself, but I want to let folks who are here watching ask some questions. So I'm going to hand it back over to Clea and just thank you so much for your thoughtfulness and letting me participate in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Dorian and Erica. My goodness, it always gets so heated right when we have to leave. But we have some very interesting questions in the chat. You guys keep asking the questions. We keep track of them. At some point in life, we get around to answering them or we're asking the same ones. So I have one specifically for you, Dorian. Thinking about the values, problem, solution, action framework. If the solution is community organizing, coming together to solve issues, then is the problem still we are so divided? This person is wondering how much to lead with that as a problem.
I think whenever you leave with problems, you demobilize people. It's like this, like I've never been successful as an organizer showing up and saying, hey, I got a whole basket of problems for you, come join us. Like, it's just nonsense. So actually I'm very skeptical of that. I do think in terms of how that was laid out, right? We do know there are some best practices. Yes, you do start with values. And that requires actually listening first to get a sense of what someone's values might be. It's very labor intensive work in some case, right? In terms of organizing work, you got to actually be a good active listener first to unearth like what are someone's, like what's Erica's fundamental values? around justice, around freedom. And then we can have a conversation about the problem that is attached to the value, but you got to get the value on the table first. And then like, there's lots of solutions. I have a preferred one. It is called organizing a collective action. That is not the only solution. But you do have to take people, I think, through that framework. I would not start with that we're divided. Like that is not start, and empirically, I'm not sure it actually works super well. Maybe it works for some people. It's not a thing that works in my work. And then lastly, I'm curious what you would say about this, Erica, because I've actually learned this as well from Color of Change. How do you also tell a story where people affected by injustice can be the heroes of the story, right? Like, how do you give people a sense of agency? Because starting with like, we're all divided and all, like that actually disempowers people in a way. So I would say it's a combination of, yes, starting with values, identifying problems, offering a range of solutions and the ability of people to take action. But also, how do you make sure you're centering people to be the agents and the heroes of their own stories in the process as well?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Dorian, in the last conversation we had about which stories you choose to tell. There are plenty of stories that exist. I mean, and not just, mythical stories, but in the work that you've done, right? In your own organizing, you've seen stories where the folks who are most impacted by these unjust systems become the heroes, are already the heroes within their communities. First of all, in a small sense within their communities, but also overcoming some of these obstacles and changing these policies. The problem is those aren't the stories that are most often popularized. Those aren't the stories that, the dated phrase, but go viral, right? Those aren't the stories that actually we're telling enough of, and in beautiful ways and in creative ways. And so I think it's just a matter of figuring out what those stories are and making sure that that's what we're leading with, that we're always leading with the idea of what makes people know, not feel empowered, but know their power.
Thank you guys for those answers. I have a question for Erica specifically, and this is as a former leader at Snapchat. We have some folks asking about social media in the chat box and wondering, what is the role of social media in creating or perpetrating these divisions that we're talking about? We've all heard about, the algorithm and how that's reinforcing beliefs and stoking division. So is social media making it better or worse, and how?
So there's a couple ways to answer the question. First, folks have to remember that these are companies. And a company has an intention and a goal. I don't care how nice the company is. I don't care how fun it is. I don't care how many, images it puts out, how pretty the colors are, how many gatherings they host. A company's job is to make money specifically for their shareholders. And so a company will do that however it needs to do that. What we hope is that there are some values that provide some guardrails, but ultimately a company's goal is to make money. And for social media companies or social media platforms, their primary currency is your attention, your eyeballs. I can't remember who it was, but I saw a clip recently where someone said, in a history of colonization, when there was nothing else to colonize, folks decided to colonize your mind, your attention, and your eyes. And so that's where we are right now. And so whether or not the intention is to divide is kind of irrelevant. It's about how much of your time is it taking and how little control do you have as a human being over how you are spending your time and over what you are consuming. And that's why I think the conversation of algorithm is so interesting and intriguing to people, because they want to know, wait, why am I seeing what I'm seeing? The problem is, once you know the answer, you still have no control over that. You can know, oh, the algorithm is showing me this because. What are you going to do about it? My colleague, Eli Pariser at his organization, New Public, is really thinking through this question right now about how do we create a new public square? How do we create social media platforms and spaces that are owned by people, owned by the people, that can, I think, move us towards more positive, idealistic goals and aims. But so the question is, what are they intending to divide us? Some are, some aren't. It doesn't matter. What they're intending to do is make money, and we are all a pawn in that process.
That was a great answer, for sure, and definitely brings around the question of intent versus impact. And, the impact is so great at this point. Does it matter to like argue about the intention? It's like, what are we going to do about it? So we have 2 minutes left. Oh, I wanted to ask one more question, but I want to honor everybody's time and get us off on time. So I do have a few housekeeping things to say to folks. For people asking about the recording, there will be a recording available. There will be a highlights reel available. I don't know if the chat can be saved or not for the person asking. I'm going to ask my other frameworkers to maybe investigate that. But I have some other good news to share with everybody. Again, thank you all for your insightful comments, Dorian and Erica here. Thank you for your insightful comments in the chat. If you guys found this conversation super interesting and you are looking to stay updated with even more things from the Culture Change Project, you can follow a little link that I just dropped into the chat and sign up for updates and notifications. And please do not forget to follow the conversation along on Twitter, where we have been live tweeting. Thank you, Jay. And you can follow the hashtag too. And congratulations to us. The Culture Change Project now has its very own Instagram account. So as we're moving forward with the project, we're going to continue to have regular research updates about various American mindsets and how we can frame these important issues, answering some of the questions, hopefully, that you guys had in the chat. And we really want to make these insights accessible to everybody and really engage in conversation, much like we saw today. So we're inviting all of you, your colleagues, your extended networks, to join us on Instagram for all the latest updates, news, and information on culture change. It'll be an educational page. We're not just going to be providing findings, and hopefully you'll be able to know about the current issues that matter to you and maybe get a smile and a laugh out of it. So this is our little handle on Instagram. Give us a follow. And our last order of business is, if you enjoyed or didn't enjoy today's roundtable, let us know by completing that survey with that link in the chat. Corinne is also has been throwing some research finding reports in there for you to peruse as well. Thank you all so much for spending your lunch hour with us. Thank you again, Marissa and Drew and Corinne and Jay and Cameron, for being behind the scenes. Thank you, Dorian and Erica, for being in community with us and for supporting the Culture Change Project. I hope everybody has a miraculous day and a wonderful winter season. And we will see you all again in the new year.